Gracias. Thank you. I'll just time it so it's a reasonable length of time that you can try and stay awake. 12:30. Okay. First of all, thank you for the invitation to speak here. It is a great pleasure and a great honor to be in this part of Spain. Unfortunately, it's only for a very short time, but thank you. The first image that we have here is describing a wonderful exhibition in 2012 in the British Museum in London. It was called Ice Age Art, Arrival of the Modern Mind. The exhibition had some of the oldest images of animals and people in the world, with drawings and sculptures created by artists during the last ice age between 40,000 and 10,000 years ago. Yesterday, Peter Rich, in his research, stretched human spiritual dimension to 150 years ago. 150,000, sorry, Peter. 150,000 years ago. So these drawings and sculptures are from the London exhibition, provided us with a fantastic insight into the earliest modern minds and their capacity to communicate sophisticated ideas symbolically through art. As the prefrontal brain developed, so did our ability as early humans to symbolize thoughts, to develop abstraction, caricature, and metaphor. Investment in art was a measure of its social value, as it still is today. This lion man from Stadel Cave in southwest Germany is 300 millimeters tall. It is made from the tusk of a young mammoth by someone with knowledge and experience of working this difficult material, which is a hard compound of mineral calcium crystals held together by organic collagen. These tusks grow around a hollow known as a pulp cavity, and the form of this half-man, half-lion, which is here, was conceived to make the best use of these characteristics of ivory. So here we have, as an image, the imagined, the form is preconceived, the understanding of a material and craftsmanship to carry out the task, and it took over 400 hours to make it. So an ancient society allows one person or some people 400 so-called unproductive hours in terms of not getting meat and food, but symbolically, someone imagined and manufactured an artwork of symbolic importance. The reason for discussing this lion man today with you is that this same process of imagining and making something of importance is what all art and what architecture continues to do. Imagining something before it exists is what makes us human. Imagining and planning and making and doing all of these to the best of our abilities creates our contemporary culture with its own unique values. Imagining is a human ability. Like our Ice Age ancestors, imagining makes us human. It is also, this image for us is about craft, knowing a material, knowing what the material can do, what it can become. It makes us think about the skill of making. It also tells us that need is more than survival. It confirms that meaning matters, and that as humans we rely on architecture to represent us. The second image, I presume it's this way, has a number of what we call hieroglyphics. This pointer here. Hieroglyphics, because I'm aware of there are many students in the room, hieroglyphics is what we call the thoughts of how the scientific aspect of being an architect begins. These drawings, we'll talk today about some of them, not all of them. This, am I pressing the right thing? The red, is it? The
top one.
This is a section that describes our project in Lima, Peru. It's a school of engineering, and we will speak about that later on. This drawing is a drawing that we made when we were discussing through Skype with Mendes de Rocha the concept of common ground. And common ground was the Venice Biennale theme of the previous one, not the current one, obviously. And this represents for us the shared, the horizontal, the line, and these below these pieces are the structure that holds Venice into the earth, the structure that these timber pieces that hold Venice in place. The work of Mendes de Rocha, which carves into ground, and these two pieces are two places, Machu Picchu and a place called Skellig Michel in Ireland. So this became for us a type of diagram, a type of hieroglyphic that holds a communication, a way of speaking our language of architecture. We'll also speak about our project in Milan for Bocconi University, and these drawings are really a way of crystallizing the need, the pragmatic, but also finding some sort of relationship between space, context, use, scale, light, and position on the earth. So the project, which we'll talk about a bit later, describes the offices for 1,000 professors and the carved ground and the question about a relationship to city. And this one here, the central one, is a project that we're building at the moment in Toulouse in France. And what's wonderful for us that this hieroglyphic, this diagram, captures, if you like, the sense of organization, that we try and find the heart of this building, which is a void. And for us, the writings of Alejandro de la Sota are very important for us in terms of the clarity when he describes that architects should make as much nothing as possible. And for us, it's in that nothing, that space, that people stand. So for us, in the Toulouse project, the nothing is this space in Toulouse, it's here, and we'll talk about our project in Lima as we go through. In terms of the beginning of Bocconi, the brief set by the competition was that half of the accommodation would be below ground and half would be above. That all the major rooms, the aulas, the aula magna for 1,000 people, and all the conference rooms would be below ground. So these are the searches by us into these amazing projects in Egypt, and looking at the Salk and looking at how Khan joins and separates and make this space with the ocean. And this project, if you like, this hieroglyphic, this sketch is really questioning the relationship of the university to the city of Milan and the question about public relations, the offices for 1,000, and how we could corrupt the ground. We really said that it's not terrific to make all these collective rooms internally. How could we bring light to the lower levels? How could we carve and corrupt the ground? The other thing, I suppose, because the room is also full of students, is that you need to, or we would encourage you to develop a sense of the wonderful works of other architects. These are sketches by Utzon, and I had the pleasure of being in the Yucatan in Mexico some years ago. And what's amazing about the Yucatan is that the below ground is limestone. As a result, the trees only grow to a certain height, and consequently, the Mayans, when they built their temples, their platforms, they knew that the trees would not be enormous. They knew the trees would have a canopy. So this wonderful drawing by Utzon, which is the canopy of trees, the Mayan platform viewing over their territory, and the photographs, and then this influences him when he's making his project in Australia. He's making this fantastic groundwork. So you have this in our, if you like, our architectural unconscious, the influences of other architects on your work. So the competition was in 2002. 10 architectural firms from around Europe were invited to participate. And we went to this city. We had known the city as tourists, but not as scientific architects or artists coming to the city. So you have the Duomo in the city, 20 minutes or so walk to the south. You have the Spanish walls. I'm in the wrong country to say this. So the Spanish walls are here, and the site is just outside that. So Bocconi University is an institution embedded in the city of Milan. One of the things that's, in terms of the pragmatic, that there is the architectural need to try and understand what people want or what they require in a project. And what's very interesting is that the university already had planning permission for a project. They already had the facility, the ability to have the offices for 1,000 people, to have the aulas, but something in that project was not enough for them. And I think it's interesting that sometimes people want something else, they can't describe exactly what it is, so they set then a competition to try and find the thing they didn't know they wanted. They knew they wanted it, but they couldn't say what it is. So this is our beginning of understanding the location. There is a busy road here, Viale Blini. There's a quieter road, Via Röntgen here. There's a connection to the campus. And what's interesting is that Bocconi is a series of buildings within the structure of Milan. And one of the key things for us, as we struggled with the competition, was where would the aula magna be? Where would the room with 1,000 people be positioned? We changed it in section. We originally had it built in the plan, very deep, connecting to the campus. But we said that this was an opportunity for the university to connect with city. So we moved, in our competition drawings, our design to move the aula magna for 1,000 people on the junction between the city and the university. So the aula magna for 1,000 is like a boulder, like a strong piece set in the corner. We then wove the pattern of students walking through the campus on what we call the stone floor of Milan. Milan is an amazing city with an incredible range of stone, and we were bringing the stone of the city, the carpet, through. So there's the aula, there's the hall for the 1,000 professors, there's the access down. You arrive on level 1, you move down this stairs to -5, you move down further to 9 meters below. For us, it was an experiment of how you could embed in the bedrock of a city, but also to be able to bring light down, not only to ground level, not only to 5 meters below, but to 9 meters. And these are the initial studies. I'd like to just read a piece about structuring space, because today's task, or today, is really describing how structure has been lost to architecture. When architecture schools and engineering schools split, I think something was lost. And we use this term, structuring space, as a way of exploring the process of defining limits and liberating boundaries. Structuring space is a result of a strategic way of thinking, precise in certain dimensions and open-ended in others. It is non-compositional approach to making space. So our interest in large-scale structure led us to explore the relationship between architecture and inhabited infrastructure. It does not initially come from dealing with large scale, but from a characteristic that a project might have and the liberation of ideas inherent in the term infrastructure that could bring a whole new meaning to space within building. So for us, these are the initial studies on finding the scale. These structures are every 25 meters, and finding, if you like, a type of abacus. The roof structure is essentially made of the organization of offices which form these courtyards to let light penetrate deeply. And these sketches are really describing the X's representing the courtyards to allow light below. And here we're looking at an idea where we're trying to find a structural idea where the soffits can be manipulated to change the character of the space below. And in terms of the structure, here we have 3.6 meter diaphragm walls, which are twinned. They are at every 25 meters, and they provide both the structure and the corridor organization for the building as it moves 150 meters to the south. And just in terms of pragmatic and the ordinary, Shelley tells a great story about this. When the contractor was making the concrete and finding how to deal with the bolt holes for the concrete shuttering, he discovered that the little cup that makes coffee is exactly the same dimension, and he was a terrific coffee drinker. So he made all the little pieces for the shuttering out of his coffee cups. So that's certainly a pragmatic use of coffee and concrete. And for us, the expression of the project within the city, this is Viale Blini, still with its trams, but that the relationship of the university with its 8-meter-high glass window allows a relationship, a symbolic as well as a practical relationship for the university. The practicalities were that the university wanted to be able to rent out the aula magna independently of the university, which meant that they can have an income independent from use by the students. And its relationship to the city is very clear. The other is the material that we used, which was an ordinary stone of Milan called ceppo, which we describe as geological concrete. And we could have chosen any of the beautiful stones of Italy, and the client was quite surprised when we chose the humble and modest ceppo. But we felt that to take the common and beautiful stone of ceppo and modify it by making these, if you like, these cliffs of stone, that we would integrate the project more into the city. We make this hard crust to protect the city or the university rooms from direct sunlight and make the view to the city contained, but also internally that we bring light in. And going back to that Alejandro de la Sota expression of architects making as much nothing as possible, for us, we really found in this project that the 22-meter cantilever of the upper part of the aula made this space, which for us has a primitive quality, which has this sense of weight bearing down, so you feel gravity. It carves a space where we change from ceppo to a beautiful stone called Bianca Laza, which has been described as being like the interior of an oyster shell. So you get weight and mass and volume and this 8-meter-high clear glass window, which both frames the city of Milan, but also brings it in. So the participant, when you're a citizen of Milan, you can be both part of the space and a voyeur. And in terms of structure, what is really important for us is that these 25-meter beams, which make a new ground, so this is street level, 5 meters below, and 9 meters below, and it is an aspect of work which is very important. This project could easily have been an office development with professors above and students below. But one of the things which is really important for us is the relationship, the visual relationship, and the section. So in the section, you get the city being able to observe below, and you get the professors being able to relate to students. So the socializing of section is an important aspect of work. And in terms of inspiration, this beautiful project by Mendes de Rocha, St. Peter's Church, where he has this hovering structure held on this central column, reflected over water, and the community is held above. And for us, this image on a rainy night in Milan, where you are outside in the street, the wet ceppo here, and people celebrating. There's a party down below. So this relationship, or the pragmatic, if you like, a relationship of letting the city see what's happening within the university, but also the symbolic relationship of university is probably one of the most important public aspects of city life. So for us, this relationship of city and use and citizen and inhabitant is really an important aspect.
This is a competition image which we made, and when we visited Milan, as Yvonne says, not as tourists, but more like detectives perhaps, we found that it was such a foggy place, and so much so that in fact, the day we went to see it, we couldn't understand the time of day. You lose time. So the effort was to try to make something which would have a presence in the wintertime and in the fogginess of this mysterious, and the mystery, the mysterious character of Milan. And that, I suppose, we often look at this image by this photograph by Sudek of Prague, and he talks about the photographer being like a detective, and he talks about this image being a community of secret individuals. But what we like about this image is that it reminds us that as architects, what we do is sometimes we make buildings which have to recede into the background, and that life is the priority, that what we're doing is making a framework for people to occupy. And somehow this captures this idea. And just moving on to the next project we're going to show, which is in Toulouse, which is another university of economics. But perhaps to lead into this, we should say that we're not showing work in Ireland this evening, because at the moment we're working outside of Ireland. But we should say that we worked in Ireland for 25 years before building outside of Ireland. And this is a very important thing, that one is rooted in one's own culture and one's own architectural language, and that gives us the confidence to somehow be able to think about working within another language. And language is something that we often look to as an inspiration. For instance, Samuel Beckett talks about the use of foreign language is the way into primal sound. And we think that's really beautiful, that when you're out of the familiar, that you perhaps find some other component because you're out of that familiar zone. And in the essay in the Common Ground book by Fulvio Irace in 2012, he made a fantastic connection, which we didn't know, between the word continuità, in Italian continuity, because the essay is about continuity or crisis, and the word tradere, to transfer, and tradire, to betray. And we're also very interested in this idea of when you're translating from whatever it is that you're responding to, that there is a component of betrayal, which sounds like a negative thing, but it's really that component of betrayal is maybe to do with the pragmatic, but it's also to do with trying to find the core or the essence of that thing that is inspiring you. So when we went to Toulouse, we really were out of our familiar territory. In many ways, Milan was more familiar to us in terms of our urban training. It was part of, you could say, an orthogonal, rational city. But here in Toulouse, we were in this organic, medieval, red brick city with all these layers of history. And we found it extremely difficult to think about how we could make a connection with this place. And we found the brick buttresses and the tiny courtyards, these windows to the sky with their little towers within these courtyards. And then we went to Albi, which is 1 hour from Toulouse. This amazing cathedral, which is defensive and also religious. And we thought about this, and Louis Kahn has been there, you can see, and made many drawings of it. And when you look at the buildings of Louis Kahn, and since being in Albi, I keep seeing Albi in the works of Louis Kahn. But what really struck us about this building was the sense of weight and mass and the way that it hits the ground. And it makes us think about what we call thresholds. And again, I love that word in Italian, soglia. I don't know it in Spanish, but that line between, it's not just the line between inside and outside, it's the line of definition or expression of the presence of an architecture. And David Leatherbarrow, professor in Pennsylvania University, has written beautifully about this, and he talks about the orchestration of light and temperature at architectural edges having social significance. And again, we find that a really interesting thing to think about, that we're not just making walls or making elevations or making forms, that we're making edges which have social significance depending on how they are manipulated. And when we started to look at how we would deal with this project in Toulouse, we were quite different to Milan. We were beside a river in a beautiful, picturesque city. There wasn't a need to place things below ground. It was part of the competition in Milan that half of the accommodation would be below ground. So we stacked the public rooms of the program and related these to the river. And we made these gaps between the public conference rooms, and that they would feel like big windows at the scale of the city. And in a sense, that comes back to the Sudeck photograph, where some things have to recede into the background in order to allow the distillation of the interpretation of the program to come through. So we put the public rooms in the foreground and put the professors in the background. And we're in this very difficult site in terms of its geometry. I think the pointer is not quite working, but we're on the prow of the site of the university here. There's a medieval brick wall. The old town is here and the new town is here. So we're at that point of junction between the old and the new town, overlooking the Midi Canal and overlooking the wonderful river of the Garonne. So we were very nervous about taking our place in this breach, in this 5-meter high brick wall. And we're very interested in mass. We're interested in that ancient sense of moving through the forces of gravity. We're interested in surface. And we, having been to Albi and looked at Toulouse, we really found we had to find a way of making a program which consisted of many repetitive offices, of making it have that sense of presence and that sense of mass. So we did something very pragmatic and very simple in some ways. We placed all the escape stairs in buttresses on the edges, and that gave us the kind of footprint within which we could build. So these, within this then, we talk about inhaling and exhaling. It's like breathing in and breathing out, this plan, where we take the city into the heart of the project, and then we push some of the spaces to the foreground. So it was very much that thing of trying to find, using the elements that we found in Toulouse, almost like a collage of the found elements, to use these as a way of bringing that sense of the city into our project. And we were asked to speak recently at a conference about photography, and what we found fascinating about that is how the photographer captures the fragment. And we realized that as architects, we're always working with fragments of memory, fragments of imagination, fragments of images, and we're trying to find ways of structuring these fragments. So our fragments were these cloisters, which Toulouse is full of. This is a sky cloister, which we call a sky cloister, which connects the president to the professor's living room. We made these terraces. And as I say, we made these buttresses. And Francisco Mangado was saying that he doesn't like flat surfaces, and we were determined, even with a brick wall, to make surface which would work in terms of light and shade, but also work in terms of the control of the environment. So each of our brick facades is modulated in a different way depending on whether they're facing north, south, east, and west, so that we have that richness in terms of the way that we make the facade. So there's a kind of anchoring or centering of the central space, and we build up these series of offices and make these big terraces between the conference rooms, which are stacked vertically overlooking the river. And again, making this foreground space between the city. This is, in a way, this is a product of looking at the courtyards of Toulouse, where you come from Place Saint-Pierre up a gentle ramp in this space, which is not inside, not outside, with a window to the sky, and then you penetrate the social heart of the project. And there's a lovely term used in the introduction, in your introduction, where you talk about the orchestration of sociability in the invitation that you gave us to deal with this theme of architecture of the necessary. And that idea of the orchestration of sociability, we think, is one of the key themes for architects, to make places where people want to come together, especially when they're places of education. And we were trying to make this central courtyard, because it's 40 degrees in Toulouse and many in the summertime, and not very cold in the wintertime. So the central foyer is external. It's protected from wind and from rain, but it's outside. And these are the windows at the scale of the city, which are the terraces between the conference rooms. And so we make these views to the bigger city beyond. So we make the social heart of the building, but you're continually connected with the environment of the city. And the view from Place Saint-Pierre, full of students, we're beside a Romanesque, wonderful brick facade, and these are two of our buttresses, which form the forecourt, what we call the sky cloister, which hovers above the ground to make a window to the sky, and this gentle ramp which takes us to the interior. We're making this project obviously out of brick. We discovered that architects in Toulouse don't use brick, even though it's a brick city. We discovered a quarry 1 hour from Toulouse where they make brick exactly the same size as the brick in the medieval wall. So we have the pleasure of working with this really ancient dimension and using it in our building. And and using this thing of very large joints and using the imperfections of the brick. As Yvonne was saying, this is now under construction in Toulouse, and by contrast, it happens that all the buildings that we're showing this evening are educational buildings, and it happens that none of them are in Ireland, which doesn't display any lack of interest on our part. But this next project was a real shock to the system in a sense, because we've always been working in quite tight urban situations, and this is a competition we won last summer for a big university about the same size as Bocconi, in the perimeter of Paris, a place called Paris-Saclay, where there's a new university to be built in, in this zone here. Xavier de Gater is the master planner, Michel Dubín is the landscape architect, and there's a whole series of competitions now being held to find buildings, find architects to make this new campus. What we found really challenging, being in this open plateau, which is windy and empty of buildings right now, was that difficulty of context being removed, that in fact one could do almost anything. We were really delighted with the color of the earth, but you can't build a project just on the color of the earth. And we were also really interested in this photograph and how it reminded us of something that we often think about and look at, is Chillida. And we went to his studio many years ago, I think it was in the year 2000, and what we loved about the maquettes and those wax models and the onyx models was that the light seemed to be trapped inside. So we were thinking about this thing that we have to make an inner world, and we have to capture the life within whatever it is that we make in Paris-Saclay. And we looked at the Bastide towns and the density of these towns, the streets and squares, and the diagonal relationship, the wonderful diagonal relationship between the commercial and the ecclesiastical square in the Bastide towns. But we were also fascinated by the Cordoba and this image of compressing and releasing within a city. And so we thought that because the density was much lower than what we would normally work with, that we would compress in order to orchestrate the sociability of the university, that we would compress the teaching spaces, the places of overlap, and that we would release space to make a piece of landscape. And we also found Ospedale Maggiore, Ospedale Maggiore, which really helped us when we were making the Bocconi project. I'm sorry about the quality of this plan, but we found that the Paris-Saclay project was exactly 2/3 of Ospedale Maggiore. And we used this where because very often it's not just what to do, it's how to get the measure of what you're doing. What dimension are we speaking about? What scale are we speaking about? And what we loved about Ospedale Maggiore when we were doing Bocconi was we were really nervous about making a facade which would be 120 meters long. We'd never done that. And that building gave us courage. And for Paris-Saclay, we were also going back and looking at the Stoa. And again, Francisco Mangado is a master of repeated elements and making these facades, these beautiful, elegant facades with the repeated element. It's something that we're always nervous about doing because we actually try to avoid it in some ways in terms of trying to make the repeated window, because for us to make the repeated good window is probably the most difficult thing in architecture. And we also looked at Turani, not just Turani's built works, but his competitions and these wonderful abstractions of these layers of framework, which make a facade which has a sense of depth. And what we did in Paris-Saclay was exactly what I've said. We compressed the educational uses into approximately half of the site, and we released half of the site to be a garden. We used the repetitive offices to make an enclosure, to make a social enclosure, an educational enclosure, but also a microclimate, because in Paris-Saclay it's windy, and we have to make comfortable microclimates. We also love the idea that an educational institution is not just a place of consumption of knowledge, that it's a place to tend to knowledge. And this idea of a garden is somehow connected with this idea of tending to knowledge. And very often in teaching and in the way that the teaching institutions are set up, they're set up to almost sell knowledge, and you can't do that. I mean, you actually can't consume knowledge. You have to discover it, and that freshness of discovering knowledge is something that we're really interested in. So you can see many references here. We got a very angry letter from a French architect who said, "Why don't you display your sources? Why don't you say out straight that you're influenced by Le Corbusier and La Tourette? You've just done a flat Tourette in La Tourette in Paris-Saclay." And we thought, well, that's a compliment. So it has many different influences, but I would say it's probably one of the most difficult projects we've done because of this thing of being in an open site. So we have these layers of courtyards, which are the educational heart of the building, and then a much more open garden where all the administrative accommodation works. And we really thought about the facade as being a kind of musical rhythm of vertical contours, where it would express the rhythm of the research office, but also give the project another dimension. And in terms of this idea of the orchestration of sociability, one of the things that we find in working with universities is that thing of making places of exchange is so important that, so we started to, as in the way that Alvarado does, where there's always natural light in lecture theatres, and we find in so many institutions that the lecture theatre is hidden away, and we wanted to start to try to expose the main lecture theatre so that when a student enters, that they know when there's something happening, that it can be closed off, but it can also open up. So this is one of the courtyards. And just a little model of a competition we did last summer, which is a completely different idea of a university. It's the London School of Economics, and you could not get a more dense context than the London School of Economics. And here we were trying to make the facade feel like a series of theatre boxes, where the professors would occupy these boxes overlooking the theatre of the street. But we were really trying to develop this whole idea of bringing the life of the street right into the heart of the School of Economics, and use in the way that Sharon does, blurs the boundaries between staircases and and sloping floors of auditoria. And we're really interested in that thing of blurring boundaries and making connections. And this competition we won again last summer, which is going ahead, which is in Kingston University in London. It was quite a different program, and what we felt in relation to this program, where in Toulouse and Milan we were making quite solid surfaces because of the conditions that we found. Here in Kingston there was a real wish to open the university up to the community, and going back to this term of thresholds and edges, we really wanted to make a three-dimensional inhabited framework, a kind of warehouse of ideas is what we call it, where again it's a series of, it's a library space, but it's also for performance and for dance and for experimental teaching. So we liked this idea of using very lean structure, making this feel almost like car park construction, but that by virtue of the, it is a very lean budget, but by virtue of the working of the overlapping of the volumes, that it would feel like a very enriching place. Derek Mahon, Irish poet, uses a beautiful phrase. He talks about making a place where a thought might grow. So I suppose there are many different places where a thought might grow. And just leading into our project in Milan and coming back to the more elemental components of architecture, again, Sudek in Prague, photographing light almost feels like liquid. And we love this project because by Carlos Prata in Porto, a new pier, which is a piece of engineering resisting the force of the sea, but it's also a piece of social infrastructure, and Yvonne will speak about that in relation to Lima. But one of the things that we found amazing about Lima was that the light became liquid in the way that the fog hovers over the city. We thought we understood fog in Milan, but it's nothing in comparison with Lima, where it refracts the light in such a way that you actually can't open your eyes. So these kind of physical experiences of being in these different cities and these different environments changes your way of thinking about how you make enclosures and how you make space.
I'd just like to speak directly to all the students who have made the commitment to these few days of the conference. You come to a conference at a nice time in the summer, you sit around with your friends, and it's also important for us as architects to meet our colleagues and to have discussions. But also conferences or sitting and discussing architecture is forming your position philosophically, architecturally. And the reason why many of us here in this room teach, or there are many reasons, but one of them is that you are building the future. You are the people, by virtue of where you decide to position yourself within the huge repertoire of architecture, you make the world of the future. So you're very precious, but forming your opinion is really important. So we see these discussions at conferences or wherever we speak as an opportunity to speak to the future, because you are incredibly valuable. You have a choice individually to stand on a piece of the earth and homogenize. You can make the earth into a McDonald's hamburger, or you can decide that you will make a paella. That you have to decide where you stand culturally. You decide. You are young, which is a wonderful thing. You have to grow your imagination, and you have to feed it on the right food. And I suppose every time Shelley and I go to other places, we ask ourselves, why do we do it? And I think it is that commitment to the future that the dialogue is really saying, what do you think now? What will you think in 50 years' time? What will you have made in those 50 years? And for us, I think what's really developing for us is that in the years of building, and somebody asked us about the crisis in Ireland, we've been through 3 crises. They come and they go. They're terrible, but they go. And then they arrive, and then they go. So in your lives, you might be through 5 of them. So sometimes it's full and sometimes it's lean, but the lean times are also opportunities. So for us, this is if you like, the reason we show you buildings is that each building is a type of experiment that every architectural studio does. And the architectural research is really testing an idea and hoping the idea is appropriate. And also, I think for students of architecture, that you learn to listen and you learn to hear and you try to learn what people haven't said. In fact, we say that architecture is a silent language that speaks, and that you need, as students, to find ways to, architect Mangado described appropriateness, and it was discussed over the last, yesterday as well, appropriateness of finding a right answer, and this is about necessary architecture, or architecture is necessary, architecture and pleasure. They forgot to put in and pain, but also the pragmatic beauty, the responsibility, I suppose, that we have as architects. I'd just like to read something which Shelley and I really feel passionate about. This is university as arena for learning, which is the beginning of our project in Lima, Peru, where we questioned what is university. And we said, surely it doesn't have to be an office park in which students go, press a button, go in an elevator, come out at the 10th floor and come down, that the social overlap and the context of this unique space. So we had this question to ourselves: can a university be an arena for learning? But there's a piece before we begin this section which we say, and this is to the students, as a question to yourselves: do you agree or do you totally object to what we're just going to say? Architecture is the new geography. What we build is the new geography. We use this term in an effort to try and understand the magnitude and the impact of building in order to reflect on what is happening to the world around us. As more and more of the natural world disappears, what we do as architects now actually makes the world we live in at a scale where it is possible to consider it as geography, not as individual buildings. Architecture is at the scale of the Earth's geography. It is modified Earth. In this context, architecture's role to hold culture is even more critical. And in future generations with you who are now students, it is absolutely critical. We walk through and feel spaces with our whole bodies, with all our senses, not just our eyes or with our minds. And the media has a lot to answer for, because sometimes the glossy magazines gives you the piece and the experience of the building is nothing like what you were led to believe. We have been exploring themes on architecture as built geography, abstracted landscape, landscape and infrastructure, humanized infrastructure, the horizon and the human being, the human need for intimacy, security, legibility, identity within the vastness of the world. We are fascinated by the idea of a project growing out of culture and physical ground. We believe what we do as architects in the making of this new landscape of building has deep societal and cultural repercussions. Architecture is a process of translation. We translate need, we translate the necessary into space. So here we have a project, a competition in a country we had never been to. This is Lima, Peru, this incredible city on the edge of the Pacific with a cliff of 40 meters that separates the city from the ocean below. And so when we were on the other side of the Earth's crust in a tiny island off the coast of Europe, we're trying to find ways of getting in under the skin of Lima. Luckily, one of our architects had spent time in Lima and she had a fantastic way of being able to describe her experience there. So these drawings for us are the beginnings of the hieroglyphics, the way of trying to find and scientifically and emotionally respond to a place where we say it has the ocean, the Pacific, it has these cliffs, we have a site which is a valley to actually cut in towards the city, we have an incredibly powerful and busy motorway, we have a very beautiful and calm area called Barranco to one side, and we began with the idea of making a cliff. So this hieroglyphic, I don't think this is working so well, that we take that the building becomes, if you like, a shoulder to the city. It becomes a new cliff, that we make this man-made piece. We take the main road as busy, we take the area of Barranco as being civilized and gentle, and in terms of the brief, the actual request from the client is that they have big laboratories, medium-sized laboratories, smaller classrooms, smaller rooms. It became like a Russian doll. So for us, in terms of the section, we were stacking the bigger spaces on the lower level and moving up to the smaller spaces, which were up on the highest level. So as we move into this territory of the place far beyond, you're also, as architects, and Shelley has touched on it, and the unconscious, you're also, as students, you're feeding your unconscious with projects that you might use in 50 years' time. And when Shelley and I were studying in University College Dublin many years ago, this book, which is kind of yellow around the edges, is really part of the studies of Le Corbusier, looking at major structures, how they affect landscape, and also projects which were important for us when we were working in London. This is a project by an architect called Niamh Brown, who built this kilometre-long housing in a study of the terraced house within British culture. And he had to deal with a busy railroad on one side. We remembered that the structure was put on rubber anti-vibration positions. But for us, what was interesting was that larger scale structure was allowing the intimacy of housing in the interior, but also dealing with the noise and, if you like, disruption of trains. And the fascination with the work in South America with Méndez de Rocha project, this beautiful image for us of the fabulous structure and the relationship to the football stadium, but really what interested us was the socializing possibility of the undercroft. So this space where structure allows for intimacy, for conversation, which is pragmatic. For us, it was interesting when we were talking, we have only met Méndez de Rocha by Skype, even though we worked on the same project for the Venice Biennale in terms of the presentation. When we were talking about doing drawings of this project, the drawings didn't exist, so we in our office redrew the project and made models of it. But his focus was on the football field, which is the green space. But for instance, for us, we weren't that interested in the football, but we were interested in the space below, the space in which people gather. So this was an important possibility of structure. And these are the interpretive early models for the project in Lima for the School of Engineering, where we have the busy road and the busy traffic at this point, where we have, if you like, an infrastructure that allows life to happen. Going back to the issue of structure and architecture, and also the climate of Lima. Shelley showed the cloud over the cliffs. Lima is an incredible city because it is 12 degrees south of the equator, but it has a cold current which comes from Antarctica, which moves up along the coast and touches at the point of Lima, which means that you have cold and hot and a balance of the earth. And they were a spontaneous, unique civilization with incredible cuisine, with incredible pottery. So the issue of sustainability and being pragmatic. We said in our building, our proposition for the project, you have a perfect climate. You have a 20 degrees usually in terms of climate. Why would you make a building where you spend incredible amounts of money on circulation, on air conditioning? Why can't an engineering student from the Andes be in a circulation space and see the Pacific and see the mountains and be outside? Why do we enclose space when you're in one of the most beautiful climates in the world? So this, for us, sustainability, the integration of sustainability, of structure, of culture, of human values is really where the pragmatic, it's hard to say beauty because beauty is a very personal word, but the pragmatics of being able to be in the climate of Lima, where we were saying it's a seismic area as well, so we have to deal with that structurally, but essentially, spatially, the integration of architecture, structure, sustainability, and socializing are things that interest us deeply. And this is really our kind of hieroglyphic of the section. And curiously enough, we had this innate, the way the building moves or sits in this, it's really, the structure is really that it leans, your knees are in this kind of position, because here the earth is, it's possible that it moves, and the way we've worked with the engineers is that we have seismic isolators at that point between the held piece and the piece that will move above. But for us, this hieroglyphic, this point of imagination, going back to the carved lion, half man, imagination, you as students, you have to grow that because that's your gift to humanity. You can imagine new things for the future. And for us, we were imagining in a place on the other side of the world, and this charcoal drawing tries to capture circulation and measure. Shelley described working in Dublin and working in Ireland all these years, that you realize, the fire officer is not a kind of a complete clown. They believe in your safety, and they're not something that you push at the end. Architecture integrates all the issues of practicality and the pragmatic into trying to make space and maybe sometimes beauty. So in terms of the plan, on the north of this drawing, you have the busy motorway. You have this shoulder of a crust which protects the campus. And the campus, you arrive in the quieter street again, like Bocconi. You arrive into the quieter area. We place most of the more public rooms on the lower level. And this project, which is over 360 meters long, is being built at the moment. This is phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And all the car parking will enter on the lower levels, or on the lower plan. But also in terms of bringing new ground and making public space, that we, in this proposition, brought the public space of the city into this space here, and also trying to make a connection across to Miraflores, which is another district of Lima. But in fact, what might happen in the future is that that bridge will connect across another busy road onto the south side, connecting into an art gallery and other parts. And going back to the architect in our office who had been to Lima, who came back, who told us about the fog, and in Spanish, the fog in Lima is described as the kind of tummy of the donkey, because it's that kind of thick fog, so it's like scratching the underbelly. But when she was making this beautiful drawing for the competition, she was really trying to capture this sense of the road, the moving up in the project, and then that it actually connects to the gods, to the sky. It actually blurs ground and sky. So we were enthralled by this interpretation of ground and sky. And the other issue in terms of materiality, Shelley showed that beautiful piece of rock from the Saclay Plateau outside Paris, but also here this fascination, this piece here is a segment of those 40-meter high cliffs onto the Pacific, and this beautiful mud, they're incredible, the section between the city and the ocean is incredible. And it's something that we'd like to refer to. There's a fantastic book on Méndez de Rocha's work by Annette Spiro. And what she talks about in terms of Adolphe Loos and Le Corbusier and the free plan and the round plan, and that the section, that the free section is something which liberates space vertically. We have discussions about a plan being the logical and the pragmatic organization of relationships, but that the section has an emotional component. So this section here is our studying the volumetric possibilities of the project, but also that we include the nature of the cliffs, that they become the new geography, that they literally become the new cliffs, that we translate the concrete into being a representation of that. And the dust, the two main issues of Lima are noise and dust. It's essentially built on a desert, and that the dust reclaims buildings over time. This is the view of the building facing towards the cascading gardens. So the roofs of the rooms and the laboratories below become these cascading gardens, changing the section. And the ambition for the library was that as you were high in these raised gardens, that you would be able to view the city and the Pacific. And this is a kind of a postcard drawing or an image that we made for this, the busy 21st century car, polluted, if you like, place, but that you're going towards the sea, and then this becomes an infrastructure for life, in which the circulation is external, and the rooms themselves then have their own kind of microclimate. And this drawing, this issue of South America and how climate affects building, this is really saying that you have this drawing for the competition was saying that you have this possibility of blurring the edges between inside and outside, between cafe, that a laboratory is something that you can view as a student into these spaces, like a shop front, that it isn't about separation, that section and the capacity of modern construction is that you can connect and overlap and link, and that you can keep things in somebody's consciousness, not just separate them, that the laboratories are the kind of dirty things in the distance, but that they are part of the everyday, and that students are aware of each other, they're aware of the city, they're aware of place. This is the competition section where we have the roads, the car parking. You're moving up through the bigger volumes. Each of the volumes then has gardens on the roof up to the loggia above. These are the drawings as we move into making. The project is on site. The inaugural date is set for the last day of December of this year. In South America, they build rather fast. They have no insulation and no waterproofing, and it's incredible. You go, no insulation and no waterproofing. It's an incredible way to build. You see the seismic separation here. This is the anchored into the earth. This is the point at which the structure is separated. We have these walls which are every 20 meters, which contain circulation and lifts and move you up through the project. And this is our paper model, which is describing the ambition of the project, the tough shoulder to the busy motorway, the cascading roofs, which have a double pragmatic use rather than them just being roofs to the next level below. And we talked earlier on about Salk and Louis Kahn, and Shelley was talking about the influence of Albee on Louis Kahn. And when you go to Salk, which is an absolutely wonderful building and, to experience, not only is it the amazing space that is to the ocean, but also these subspaces which are shadowed and connection for research. And there's a wonderful story, not about these spaces, but about this central space, which is the value of conversations. Louis Barragan convinced Kahn not to put the trees into the central space. And there are wonderful drawings in Philadelphia which describe what Kahn would have done, but that Barragan convinced him to make this space with the sky and the water and the surface. So sometimes a conversation you have over coffee or a conversation you have can change the nature of a project. And the last image, this is before Shelley does the conclusion, is that this is in our project for Lima, where we have tried to integrate landscape with space to make this infrastructure for life, where the classrooms and offices and laboratories share the new space in terms of infrastructure. Oh, sorry, just this one before Shelley comes. We just loved this in terms of pragmatism. This is the sample of the concrete being made on site. Here are the workers on their lunch break, and they're having a little siesta. So we have structure, shadow, and humanity in terms of even the smallest shade in a country where the sun is strong is really of value.
When we were doing the competition, we discovered these images of these kind of constructs which we'd never seen, called huacas. And when we visited this huaca in Lima, what we found really sobering about it was that it's a monumental construct, but it's not about assertion of power. And also it's a man-made landscape. In terms of this idea of new geography, it feels like, it is a man-made mountain. And apparently these were places of ceremony and ritual, but also built to somehow bring about the balance of man and nature. And when we were doing the competition in Lima, because one has to be careful about working in places so far away that you don't know, because you feel arrogant. And we were really encouraged by this image. Well, first of all, we were already, I would say, emotionally involved by the work of many South American architects, Vilanova Artigas and Villanueva and Paulo Mendes de Rocha. But when we saw this image, we felt, well, there are connections between cultures. On the left-hand side, obviously, is Machu Picchu, and on the right-hand side is this island called Skellig Michael in Irish, which is in the Atlantic Ocean. And what we found incredible about this was just the connections in terms of human habitation, that sense of the heroic landscape and the sense of the intimacy. And when one visits this monastic settlement in the west of Ireland, what's incredible about it is that the domesticity of the monks, it's actually very moving. You can still get a sense of the enclosure of the herb gardens. So there's this thing of intimacy within a heroic landscape. And we felt in the site in Lima that it had this almost hostile sense because of the motorway and the bigness of the city. And that what we were trying to make was a kind of framework which could deal with, on the one hand, this sense of the hostile, and on the other, this sense of intimacy. But I think it also gave us courage about cultural landscapes and the connections that one can find between very different cultures, thousands of miles apart. Machu Picchu, 15th, 16th century, and Skellig Michael between the 6th and the 12th century. But we found this really a useful kind of image. And I suppose one of the other things that we really think about is that the past is a living present. There is no difference for us between past and present. And what we found, again, doing the Venice Biennale, moving from paper sketch models to fragments of our project with this reminder of this heroic landscape in the background, was that what's interesting about fragments is that it leaves room for the imagination. When you see a ruin, you imagine what was in the past. When you're trying to make a project in the future, you're making a fragment and you're trying to imagine the future. And of course, for us, the kind of master in terms of the description of time and this time sense of timelessness is T.S. Eliot. And in a beautiful essay, which is called Tradition and the Individual Talent, he says, art never improves, but the material of art is never quite the same. Tradition cannot be inherited. If you want it, you must obtain it by great labor. Thank you.
Thank you.